Hi everyone, and welcome to this assessment briefing webinar aimed at supporting you with completing assessment 5015 as part of your Level 5 CMI Coaching and Mentoring Certificate. I'm Karen, an Associate Coach and Learning Facilitator, and I support Boot Coaching in delivering CMI coaching and mentoring programs. So the aim of this webinar is to help you understand the learning outcomes and assessment criteria and how to tackle these for assessment 5015. We'll also talk about how to go about researching for this assessment and also how to structure and present it in the best possible way. Finally, we'll touch on word count and we'll explore what's the best way to approach this. If you've already watched one of these webinars and you've done a previous assessment, feel free to skip the sections that you've already watched on another assessment briefing, but they might serve as a good reminder. Obviously, the learning outcomes and assessment criteria discussed here are specific to this particular assessment. Unit 5015, Management of Coaching and Mentoring, is about understanding the process of planning and implementing coaching and mentoring within your organisation, and also looking at the benefits that this might bring. For this assessment, there are 3 learning outcomes. Firstly, you need to be able to understand the impact of coaching and mentoring programs on an organisation, and within this learning outcome, there are 3 assessment criteria that you need to address. You also need to be able to manage the implementation of coaching and mentoring, and there are 4 assessment criteria to cover here. And finally, be able to monitor and evaluate the operation of coaching and mentoring within an organisation, and 3 assessment criteria to cover under this learning outcome. So each learning outcome is broken into a number of assessment criteria. You need to pass all of the assessment criteria to be able to pass the assessment. The assessment covers both coaching and mentoring. One of the things to be mindful of when you're tackling an assessment is the command verbs. Now, this is usually the first word in the assessment criterion. Here you can see that the command verb is identify, and then you've also got evaluate. These words tell you how to address the criteria. Some of the command words require higher order skills. So for example, your answer is going to be much more in depth if you're evaluating as opposed to identifying. Common ones in your assessment are assess, evaluate, discuss, explain, and identify. You can find the definitions of the command verbs in your candidate handbook, and this is available on our website in the CMI section. As you can see, there is a real difference between if you're being asked to evaluate, so here you need to consider some of the strengths and weaknesses, some of the arguments that are for and against, or even similarities and differences depending on what the question is asking you to do. You should therefore be drawing some conclusions as well. Also going to need to back up your answers with some research and theory, so it's much more in depth, as you can see, than if you were asked to identify. Here, you're just looking for the origin, nature, or characteristics of something. So you almost may be listing something, not just with one word though, but using full sentences. Throughout your assessments, you need to back up your work and your answers with your wider reading, the theory, and also examples from your organisation. This will really show the assessor that you understand what you're being asked to do. So really try and stick to what the criteria is asking you for and make every word count so that everything you write is relevant to it and you're not veering away from this. The learning outcomes and assessment criteria are organised into an assessment brief. This is to make it easier to address the assessment criteria. You may find that assessment criteria from different learning outcomes are organised into one task, so it might not follow the exact order of the syllabus. It'd be helpful to start your assessment with a brief overview of the organisational context, or even your role if this is relevant to the assessment. This should be included in an introduction and won't be included in your word count. If you don't have an organisation you can write about, you can use the scenario provided. And here they're suggesting that you're a middle manager with responsibility for helping an organisation compile a business case for coaching and mentoring, and then planning, implementing and monitoring this approach. You'll find it really helpful to refer to the syllabus when completing your assessments. You will have been sent this when you started your programme, but you can also find it on the CMI website. This gives you lots of hints and tips within the good practice guidance as to how to address the assessment criteria. It'll suggest books that you can read or theories that you can have a look at, different authors and people involved in the research of coaching and mentoring. It is quite a large document, but if you search for the assessment number, you'll soon find the right section. So let's get into looking at the tasks within this particular assessment. So assessment 5015 is organised around 4 tasks. As I mentioned before, for each task try and back up your answers with relevant theory and examples from your organisation that you're basing the assessment on. There are 3 assessment criteria to address for task 1. So the way to think about your word count is to divide the guideline word count, so here it's a maximum of 750 words, so divide that between the number of assessment criteria, so divided by 3, it'll give you roughly 250 words per assessment criteria. Obviously you might want to adjust that a little bit based on what you're being asked to do and what we said before about the command verbs. Clearly this assessment criteria 1.2 and 1.3 is going to be a little bit more in depth and might need to give a few more words to these because you're being asked to evaluate rather than just identify. But do try and balance your word count so that you're not spending too many of your words just on one assessment criteria and then leaving yourself too short for another. So for assessment criteria 1.1, you're asked to really look into what are the uses of coaching and mentoring within organisations? What can it help your organisation with? And there are some suggestions on the syllabus, and it talks about how coaching and mentoring might be used to support business plans, support team development, or even personal development. Again, they mention lots of research. The CIPD is a really good source. And don't forget to look at all the data from the CMI website. And also not forgetting to use the Management Direct tool. I'll have a look at this later on because all of the assessment criteria are mapped to learning resources and you'll be able to find some good resources there. So for assessment criteria 1.2, you're asked to evaluate the benefits of coaching and mentoring to an organisation or the organisation that you're writing about for your assessment. And don't forget this is an evaluate question. So here you're probably expected to write a little bit more, and they're asking you here to critically evaluate. So considering those benefits and have a look at some of the wider reading and what the theorists say are the benefits, and then explore to what extent these are actually true, to what extent does coaching and mentoring actually deliver those benefits. So really thinking about critically evaluating to what extent do you agree with what the writers are saying and what evidence have you got to back that up. So you'll be thinking about the benefits from different perspectives. So don't just look at one writer. Try and look at a few different sources. What do the different writers say about the benefits? Again, assessment criteria 1.3 is an evaluate question, so a little bit more in depth here. Thinking about the organisational HR implications of using coaching and mentoring. So when we think about human resource implications, the sorts of things you might want to consider are around the culture of the organisation, staff development, retention, how engaged are employees, so employee engagement, does it have an impact on this by using coaching and mentoring? The impact on learning and development, and also things like sort of talent management and succession planning. So those are the kind of HR implications you might want to discuss. Thinking about the organisation, sort of broader impacts on the organisation, You could consider things like levels of motivation, engagement and morale, different types of leadership. Those are also suggested as well in the syllabus. In the syllabus as well, it does suggest that you do want to have a look at some of the wider reading around this. Clutterbuck has been mentioned as one of the writers in here, and so is Goleman and Hersey and Blanchard. You'll be able to find some of these writers and some summaries of their work on the Management Direct website. So moving on to task 2, the word count here is a maximum of around 850 words, and if you divide that by the 3 criteria, it gives you roughly 283 words. Because you've got an evaluate question here, an evaluate assessment criterion, you're going to probably want to give a few more words to that particular area, and the identifiers may be going to be a little bit less detailed. So for 2.1, you need to evaluate the impact on an organisation of establishing a coaching and mentoring culture. I think a really good place to start here is actually to define what is actually meant by a coaching and mentoring culture. And there's been an awful lot written about this. There are lots of books on this, and you'll be able to find some articles as well. Again, looking on Management Direct, that might be helpful. Clutterbuck has written quite a lot, Clutterbuck and Megginson, on coaching culture, so that might be a source that you want to have a look at. So the question is asking you to think about what the impact is. So you need to work out, how do you actually go about measuring the impact of coaching and mentoring on the organisation's culture? What are the processes that are used? And these could be quantitative measures or qualitative. Things like looking at absence levels, levels of discipline and grievance cases, maybe using feedback from staff. You might have an engagement survey that you could use, or even maybe using some focus groups or something like that to follow up on coaching and mentoring programs. And really sort of thinking about this from all sorts of different perspectives, so not just from the employee's perspective, but also what's the perspective of your senior leaders or the managers involved in coaching and mentoring. If you have a look at some of the sources, again mentioning CIPD, you'll find there's actually quite a lot of research on this, and they'll have some data. So if you can't get hold of data for your own organisation, you could maybe use some of the reliable data from a source like the CIPD. Another resource that you might want to have a look at is one of our webinars where we talk about the impact of coaching and mentoring, and we talk about return on investment and return on expectation. There are some suggestions there on how you might be able to measure the impacts, so do have a look at that. Also on our YouTube channel, you'll find there's a webinar around culture, and it discusses coaching and mentoring culture as well, so that might be helpful to you. For 2.2, identify the barriers to change. Change can be quite difficult sometimes, so if you're trying to implement coaching and mentoring in your organisation, there might be some things that get in the way. It suggests in the syllabus that you maybe want to have a look at Kubler-Ross's model. So it's quite a well-known model around reactions to change, and it's often called the change curve. If you log into Management Direct, you'll be able to find a really good summary of this, and sometimes using diagrams to help you explain some of these theories can be really helpful too, but just make sure that you reference them. There are lots of barriers you could obviously cover, so often things relating to a lack of resources to implement coaching and mentoring, that could be something you talk about. It could be around budget constraints, or it could be about people's understanding of coaching and mentoring, that maybe they maybe don't see the value of it. So that could be something too. So something around culture and what's getting in the way there of people seeing those benefits. A really helpful model in change management is Kurt Lewin's force field analysis. So this would be quite good for this answer, because the idea is that you look at the things that are driving change as opposed to the things that are actually resisting. You could even use a diagram to represent these in your assessment. So thinking about the things that actually stop coaching and mentoring happening, and then the other parts of the questions. So the last criterion is asking you to explain how you'd actually overcome resistance to implementation of coaching and mentoring. So it could be useful to present this maybe as a table, so with the things that are barriers on one side and then the ways that you might overcome it on the other side. So that could be helpful to you. If you can, try not to be too general or vague and try and really come up with examples from your organisation and describe them in enough detail, and try and ensure that you've got enough different examples, not just maybe one or two. So for task 3, you've got a few more words to play with. So it's 850 words and just 2 assessment criteria. So roughly 425 words per assessment criterion. So looking at 3.2, looking at processes and mechanisms to be able to record and monitor the impact of coaching and mentoring. So maybe starting with what the objectives and purpose of the coaching and mentoring were in the first place, and then considering what methods would you use in your organisation to be able to do this. So it could be that you have kind of weekly reviews or reporting mechanisms. You might have a questionnaire that you do at the beginning of a coaching and mentoring process, or you might use your performance management process to help you with this, or even things like journal entries or reflections, or things like 360-degree feedback can be quite useful. Again, have a look at the return on investment webinar, because we do talk a bit more detail about mechanisms for measuring the impact of coaching and mentoring. So 3.3, this is asking you to think about how will you actually measure whether the implementation of your coaching and mentoring program has actually worked, and how do you make sure that it leads to continuous improvement for your organisation. If you have a look at Management Direct, you'll find that there are some really helpful models and definitions of some of these concepts. So continuous improvement, there are a range of different resources. And then also you might want to consider having a look at the concepts of total quality management. There's a really nice definition of total quality management here in Management Direct. So really just thinking about how do coaching and mentoring actually continue to support the organisation, and how we actually monitor it in the future to make sure it still works and it's still meeting the needs of your organisation. So moving on to the final task, task 4, again 850 words, so again 425 words roughly per assessment criteria. Here this task is quite practical, so you're actually creating 2 different plans. So one plan is about how you would support an individual in adopting change, and the other plan is about how you'd implement a coaching and mentoring program for your organisation. So when you're thinking about the individual, you could consider a specific individual and how you'd actually help them develop and work towards change, or change a behaviour. It could be an attitude, or it could be skill or knowledge level or something like that. The sorts of things that you would consider in any plan would be what is the overall goal, what are your time scales, when is it going to be reviewed, how are you going to measure it, what are the activities that are actually going to help. And then for 3.1, this is more of an implementation plan for a program of coaching and mentoring in the organisation. If you have a look again at Management Direct, you'll find there are lots of templates for implementation plans. I've just searched for implementation plan and it's come up with a range of different templates, and there's one here called Change Management Plan that might be useful. But you could just have a look at these for some ideas of what kind of things will be included in a plan. So as you might expect, a good plan would have an overall purpose, it'd have goals, you'd know who the stakeholders were and how you're going to get buy-in from them. There'd be a clear plan of activities. You might consider things like budgets and marketing, even training, how you're going to monitor it and how you're going to evaluate it. Clearly you've not got a huge amount of words to play with, so it's going to be quite a summarised plan, but I'd expect to see some subheadings within this particular section and make it look a little bit like a real plan. So now that we've given you an overview of how to tackle the assessment criteria and learning outcomes, let's talk briefly about how to go about carrying out your research. If you've listened to one of these assessment briefing webinars before, feel free to skip across this section if you think you know what you're doing already, but it might be a good reminder for you in any case. And we'll just talk through where you might start. So obviously the syllabus, as I mentioned, is a really good starting place. It always suggests some theories that you might want to look up. In terms of where to find resources, I've shown you the CMI resources that are listed in your candidate handbook. If you have a look in the candidate handbook, there are instructions on how to actually access these resources. And these are listed on page 26, and it talks you through step by step how to find things. You've also been provided with a coaching and mentoring handbook, and you can see at the back of this on page 45, there's a really handy list of some recommended reading. You've also been provided with a textbook. Now this is a really good place to start too. It's quite a good textbook that has some really helpful ideas. Coaching and Mentoring at Work by Connor and Pecora. So just some final tips really on carrying out research. Try to avoid relying on too few sources, but also don't overwhelm yourself by a huge amount of reading that's just going to stop you from getting started. You might want to just start with researching a topic at a time so that it's more manageable and you can do it in bite-sized chunks. I know that we like to use Google and it is really helpful, but avoid quoting actual Google or quoting sources like Wikipedia, because we need to just make sure that we're finding a really reliable source. And I know that lots of people contribute to Wikipedia and we don't always know that it is reliable. So if you look on Wikipedia first, you might find some theorists and you could look those up to try and find an actual source that has been written by them. So let's talk about structure and presentation. If you have a look on page 23 of your candidate handbook, you'll see a really helpful submission checklist which explains how you need to format your assessment and gives you a list of everything that you need to include. So try to keep your structure really logical. Follow the structure that's set out in the brief. It'll really help you, and just outline that in advance. It might be useful to just drop some of the key headings that you're going to use into a Word document to start with. Try and break up your writing with headings and also some subheadings. Try not to use really large paragraphs. Stick to just using 1 point per paragraph. If you'd like to, you can use diagrams and tables where it helps support your work. It might also help you with word count, but don't forget that you do need to reference anything that's not your own work. Don't forget to include an introduction. As I mentioned earlier, in your introduction you might want to talk about the organisational context or a role if that's relevant, and an introduction won't be included in your word count. You can use appendices if you'd like, but they're not actually marked, they're not included in your word count. They may be helpful to support your assessment, but they're not essential. In terms of your writing style, try not to write in the first person, so using I, unless you're required to complete a reflection. And just try not to pad out your assessment with waffle, and just keep it really written in plain English. And make sure that you're proofreading your work. It's surprising sometimes people do submit and they just want to get rid of the assessment, get it submitted, and they maybe haven't always proofread it. If it helps, you could always ask someone else to proofread it for you and sense check it. Obviously, don't forget to spell check and grammar check your work. And if you need to, then get help with that too. Avoid paraphrasing too closely from your sources as well, because that can look like plagiarism. We'll touch on referencing a little bit later on, but there is a separate webinar on this that you can watch. So let's have a look at word count. Sometimes this can be a challenge. So some people find that they write too much and some people find they don't write enough. But try and budget your overall word count so that you know how many words are needed for each section, and then divide that up by the number of assessment criteria roughly. But don't forget to allow a little bit extra for where you've got a criteria that's asking you to evaluate, which is going to be more detailed than an identify criterion. Try not to use lots more words on one criterion so that you're leaving too few for another. And if you need to, just have a look and see where you've got any repetition and get rid of that. Stick to your word count. You could go maybe sort of 10% over, but if it's any more than that, there's potential for your assessment to be returned and for you to be asked to cut it down a little bit more. If you're well under, like more than 10% under the word count, it's likely that you haven't covered the criteria in enough depth. If you do go over the word count, just check how many words you've used for each criterion and just make sure that you reduce it and budget against each of those assessment criteria before you submit it. The things that aren't included in your word count are your introduction, as I've mentioned, so an introduction to your organisation, your job role, or sometimes you might include a definition of coaching and mentoring in that introduction. So use the heading introduction and that wouldn't be included in your word count. Other things that aren't included are if you use an index or context page, your headings, diagrams, charts and graphs, they're not included. Anything that you've contained in your references and also bibliography, or if you've used a reflective statement. So there is a separate webinar on referencing that goes into more detail, but just in summary, all of your external sources that you've used should be referenced so that you're not presenting them as your own work. Try to use a recognised referencing system. Harvard-style referencing is really well recognised and it's quite easy to use once you get the hang of it. Try to use an original source where you can, or if you're using a secondary source, just have a look at how you go about referencing secondary sources. There is a helpful document on the CMI website which goes into lots of detail about referencing, and there are some helpful online tools that you can use. So there are some free ones that help you reference. One of them is called Cite This For Me. And then if you have a look at the tools on Microsoft Word, if you've not already done this, there is a referencing tool on there which is really handy and it helps you put things into alphabetical order and it will keep things up to date and in the correct order for you as well and presented in Harvard style referencing. So we've come to the end of this assessment briefing. So just a quick reminder, really try and stick to the assessment criteria and not veer away from it. Really pay attention to those command verbs and you can find the definitions as I mentioned in your candidate handbook. Try and back up your work with examples from your reading and also from your own organisation to bring your assessment to life and to show your understanding. The syllabus will really help you. It will guide you with some of the theory that you need to have a look at, and just try and budget your word count. And then finally, just to wish you all the best and good luck with your assessment. If you do need any extra help, you can get in touch with us using our email address here, so the CMI email address. And you can also get help on one of our drop-in sessions, so you're welcome to attend these. We tend to run these around 3 times a month, and anybody can join those at any time. Just let us know and we'll book you on one of those and we should be able to help you with any questions you've got around assessments. So thanks very much for listening and best of luck.